All right. In this session, we're going to talk about Nuke knobs, nodes, and control panels that deal with color management. Our first one is the preferences. So if you open your prefs under color management, this is where you set the default color management system when you open a new Nuke. Pretty easy, not too much about it. There is one other one that's at least worth noting, is if you're using a computer that has a broader gamut screen, like a MacBook Pro that has a P3 screen, it will change how your colors look depending on what your viewer buffer bit depth is set to. If you set it to byte, it'll clamp the gamut to whatever your viewer process is. If you leave it on half float, it will float above those sRGB values typically, as those monitors are P3. So that's the first place that you can touch color management. But again, this is for setting, when you open a new script, this will set the default. Next up is your project settings. And I can show you here. So we have Nuke and OCIO. Nuke is obviously the Nuke managed. OCIO lets you then use a config file. It references the config file for all management. If you set this to Nuke right here, it will set all your read nodes to use the Nuke default profiles, but it still allows you to set an OCIO config. So if you're using OCIO labeled nodes, they're referencing the OCIO config, while things like read nodes and write nodes are referencing the Nuke profiles, Nuke default profiles. So that can be really good if you need like a little bit of extensibility. You can't change, like you're stuck in a Nuke default world. You can load an OCIO config on the side and then actually do the management via OCIO color space nodes outside of the Nuke management itself. And that takes us to our next spot. So read nodes and write nodes. In older Nuke, this will be labeled color space. In more modern versions, it's called input transform. Under the hood, the knob is actually still referenced as color space, and they are going to deprecate that at some point, and that will have a different name. But currently, it's still color space. And then here, this is what you would get if you were in a Nuke default world. These are all the options you get. Now let's talk about specific nodes relative to color. The first is our write node. In older versions of Nuke, this is a little bit different in that you only have a color space knob that looks just like the one on the read node. So you would just pick the color space and move on. In newer versions, now you have a transform type option. There's color space and there's display. If you look at a ACES 1.3 config, for example, you now have, there's a difference between display spaces and color spaces. And this allows you to actually use display spaces to pick, like say you wanted to render with a tone mapped profile. You could actually set that here. You'd set your display type and then the profile for that display type. If you just want your standard IDT, you would go through you'd set your transform type to color spaces, and then you can pick your color space, whatever it needs to be. So that's the one difference with the write nodes, depending on which version of Nuke you're in. And then we have our OCIO color space nodes. There's a handful of these. So OCIO color space is the main one, and that lets you set an input and an output. One little quick tip. Your output usually should be your working space. In older Nuke, using a color space node, you would set it to where you want it to be, but when you're in a modern ACES 1.3, ACES 1.2, any ACES profile really, your output should go to your working space. Just a little quick tip. There's the OCIO display node. So say you have a LUT that got applied in a specific space, you can use an OCIO display to correct for your display. Like it's a Rec 709 LUT, but you have an sRGB monitor. You can use these display nodes. Basically, these are what you have in your viewer process menu, similar to what the write node has when you set it to display. Next up is log convert. It's log to len, len to log. This is based on your OCIO profile and what your OCIO has roles where you can set certain, and let me actually open one really quick. So you can actually set roles for the various options for OCIO. So in this case, we're telling it compositing log is ACES CCT. You would actually probably set this to your camera native log format. And then when you use this log tool, it's going from that camera native to ACES. So that can be useful in a pipeline standpoint. If you're using modified, per show OCIO configs, you would set that up and then you would use that log convert to do that work for you. Next up is name transform. This basically gives us all of the named transforms. And then we have file transform. If you're in a world where maybe you don't have a named transform, you can use an OCIO file transform. This will let you use any kind of like CDL file or LUT file, SPI 1D, SPI 3D, SPI MTX. And you can kind of basically manually build your color stack using physical files. Next, we have CDL transforms. You can either manually enter CDL info in, or you can read from file. You can also use this to export CC files. And then there is OCIO look transform. You set your input space. You can set your look. Looks are an additional layer inside a config that allow you to apply secondary color transforms without having to build new color spaces. They start to get a little more advanced. You see them in some places, but this can be really useful if you're just trying to apply basically like a show LUT, shot LUT, and you have a specific look as part of your config. In terms of non-OCIO based color tools, we have our color space node, and we have our input output. Basically, the color space in is the transfer function. Then we have our illuminant, which is our white point. And then we have it's labeled primaries or our gamut. Again, this doesn't have all the options that an OCIO config is going to have, because these are hard-coded into Nuke itself and therefore don't get updated as regularly. They do have Area Wide Gamut 4. That's the most recent addition, but like we don't have Sony, S-Gamut 3, S-Gamut 3 Cine, all the fun latest profiles that most people are shooting with. Then we have vector field. Vector field is how you apply a LUT. So if you have a cube file, this is the tool you're using. And then color matrix. And I'll go deep into color matrices in a different session. You can use a color matrix to convert from one gamut to another gamut losslessly. So in a case where you don't have the ability to use, true color management, you can basically get around that with a color matrix node. Which also brings me to the expression node, which can be used to also generate transfer functions. And again, I'll go into those two specifically and kind of recreate some color management using physical nodes, just sort of to show how it's done. Yeah, so that covers Nuke knobs, nodes, and controls.